Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Stern. I am the founder and president of EMET, and it is my extreme pleasure to welcome you to yet another very topical and very timely EMET webinar. As most of you are aware, Chief of Staff of the IDF, Aviv Kochavi, has said that the Iranians are a matter of weeks to months from nuclear breakout, and has asked his generals to drop plans for an attack on Iran. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken has said it's a matter of weeks. As you also are probably aware, Iran has begun enriching uranium to the 20% purity level, which makes it very easy for them to slide to the 90% level, which is necessary for a nuclear bomb. And I've read estimates that they have 10 to 12 times the amount allowed under the JCPOA. We know that President Biden, while on the campaign trail, said he wants to return to the Iranian nuclear deal or negotiate a better one. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken had said in his confirmation hearing that he wants the deal to be longer and stronger. Many times throughout the last few months, we have read statements from the Iranians saying that they do not want to renegotiate the deal. But just recently, I've read that they said they will allow the EU to be in charge of the negotiations. We know where the problems are with the 2015 deal. And I could just reiterate some of them. It includes rapidly approaching sunset clauses, one of which has already been reached on October 18th. A prohibition of including anything having to do with missile development or delivery, and a provision allowing the Iranians 24 days to clean up any suspected sites. And of course, we had wanted 24 days, and they changed it to 24 hours. How can the United States negotiate a better deal? And even if it were possible, what is it in the Iranian record that proves that they will keep to the deal and not cheat? These are questions that our guest, David Albright, is probably in the position to answer that very few others are. And we're profoundly honored to have him back once again with us as a speaker. David Albright is the founder and president of the Institute for Science and International Security. He's a physicist who directs the work of the Institute and has published in several journals, including the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Science, Scientific American, Science and Global Security, the Washington Quarterly, and Arms Control Today. Research reports by David Albright have been published by the Environmental Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and Princeton University's Center for Energy and Environmental Studies. And David has provided the world with some very necessary data about Iran's nuclear program. As I say, we're profoundly honored to have you back again, David. So how far do you believe the Iranians are in the nuclear project, and what is in their record to prove to us that they will not cheat if there is a better deal?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Glad to be back, and glad that this time my internet is working much better. For more than 2 decades, the United States has prioritized preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. While Iran has been thwarted from building those weapons, those efforts have not succeeded in getting Iran to stop its march toward dangerous nuclear weapons capabilities or to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency, or I'll call it here IAEA, to ensure that Iran's nuclear programs are truly peaceful. The battle to keep Iran from building nuclear weapons rages on, encompassing many fronts. But I want to emphasize up front, rejoining the JCPOA without first fixing it while dropping US sanctions is a dangerous option, an ineffective option, in fact, in preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And I'll talk about that more as I go along. At its best, the nuclear deal, or JCPOA, was not expected to settle the nuclear question because of its short sunsets, relatively short sunsets on nuclear limitations, and inadequate verification arrangements over potential and actual military nuclear activities. It certainly was ill-equipped to settle Iranian missile issues or any of the multiple regional conflicts in play for years. One could argue that the deal worsened the situation with respect to ballistic missiles and regional issues by supplying the regime with a steady stream of oil revenue and incentivizing Iran to create a conventional deterrent in the region. One result is that almost daily military skirmishes of one type or another occur in the region. Even on the fundamental nuclear proliferation issue, the JCPOA did not settle the question of whether Iran had or has an ongoing nuclear weapons program. At best, it kicked this key issue to the IAEA, which so far has been unable to make much progress in determining one way or the other. This inability is registered every 3 months by the IAEA reporting it cannot determine or certify Iran's nuclear program as peaceful. Iran's lack of cooperation with the IAEA, its maintenance of nuclear activities in violation of major non-proliferation commitments, have led others to act to increase transparency of Iran's secret nuclear weapons activities. In early 2018, Israel seized a cache of top secret Iranian documents and CDs in Tehran about Plan EMET, Iran's crash nuclear weapons program in the early 2000s. The goal of the EMET plan was to produce 5 nuclear weapons, 4 missile deliverable, and 1 ready for use in an underground nuclear test. The documents show a nuclear weapons program that was far larger and more advanced than thought before the discovery of the archives. The documents show clearly, or conclusively, that Iran knows how to build miniaturized nuclear weapons. In a welcome development, the archive reinforced, visible through the sacrifice entailed in closing down the EMET plan, just how vulnerable the Islamic Republic of Iran was to outside pressure and disruption. Military threats, fear of economic sanctions, international condemnation, forced transparency, and diplomacy all combined to convince Iran's leaders in 2003 to halt its crash nuclear weapons program and accept a halt or freeze in its enrichment program. And that freeze went way beyond what the JCPOA was able to achieve. However, Iran did not stop its nuclear weapons program. It transformed it. Under the leadership of the recently deceased head of the EMET plan, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, Iran orchestrated a careful parsing of many of EMET's programs into covert and overt nuclear weapons-related activities, preserving key capabilities and personnel while seeking progress on nuclear weapons. What does an Iranian nuclear weapons program look like today? First, one needs to look more carefully at what defines a nuclear weapons program in a country like Iran. Iran does not appear today to have a program focused on the actual building of nuclear weapons. I should add that this is not because of a lack of Iran trying or goodwill or some fatwa on its part, but a result of countries and international institutions determined to prevent Iran from acquiring them, sometimes using diplomacy and enforced transparency, sometimes using espionage, and sometimes violence. What Iran has today is a program to be prepared to build nuclear weapons and to do so in relatively short order. It is important to repeat that Iran does not appear to have a nuclear weapons program like the one in Pakistan or in South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s. It did have such a program in the EMET plan, but that program has been stalled. Iran also is way beyond what is sometimes called a latent nuclear weapons program, a term sometimes pinned on Japan with its large stock of separated plutonium. What Iran has is a program to produce nuclear weapons on demand. Somebody in Iran is thinking about nuclear weapons, preserving and even advancing nuclear weapons capabilities, including related information, equipment, and fighting off exposure. Taiwan had a similar nuclear weapons program in the 1980s. Its leadership, fearing a Chinese invasion and calculating how long it could hold out, ordered that its nuclear establishment be able to produce a deliverable nuclear weapon in 3 to 6 months, following an order to make them. The US learned important details of this program via CIA spy and was so threatened, it moved to rip it out root and branch. It effectively denuclearized Taiwan. We do not know how or if Iran, like Taiwan, has thought through a precise timeline to a deliverable nuclear weapon. This is certainly a difficult question to answer from the outside. Can simply rejoining the JCPOA deal, can simply rejoining the nuclear deal with this type of nuclear weapons program? I think the answer is no, certainly not by itself. In fact, Iran likely supports the JCPOA in part because the nuclear deal does not do well at preventing or exposing such a nuclear weapons program. Where is Iran in its nuclear buildup today? A measure of that buildup is what we call breakout, the amount of time to produce enough weapon-grade uranium for a nuclear weapon. That time is now, according to our estimates, as short as 3 to 4 months, and less than 6 months to produce enough for 2 weapons. These estimates could reduce further as Iran accumulates significant amounts of near 20% enriched uranium, which Sarah alluded to, and Iran continues installing advanced centrifuges. Now, these estimates measure the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program. If Iran decided to actually break out and build nuclear weapons with this weapon-grade uranium, how long would it take to obtain its first 1 or 2 bombs? There are 2 key parts to this question: an underground nuclear test and missile deliverable nuclear weapons. Today, I assess that Iran is able to conduct an underground nuclear test in 6 to 9 months, assuming production of enough weapon-grade uranium for a nuclear weapon in as little as 3 to 4 months. Building a reliable nuclear warhead perched on a missile would take longer. Fortunately, Iran didn't finish all its work during the EMET plan. Some work was left unfinished, and there's great uncertainty about how much they've done in the last 17 years, although certainly some work has happened, but perhaps not all of it. So it's very hard to determine how long it would take Iran to build a reliable warhead mounted on a ballistic missile, but 1 to 2 years is often cited. Some may think it involves a shorter timeline. The bottom line is the answer is highly uncertain. An initial goal limited to an underground test should not be underestimated. When states conducted an underground nuclear test, the political and strategic effects were usually profound, even without any clear indication of deployed nuclear weapons. In the case of Iran, enemies would be left to ponder. How many weapons does Iran have? Where are they? The uncertainty would buy time for Iran to eventually, but inevitably deploy nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. On a parallel track, the Nuclear Archive has also opened a pathway to more effective International Atomic Energy Agency inspections. Inspection efforts that I should say could be jeopardized by merely rejoining the JCPOA. One of the problems is that the nuclear deal has tended to soft pedal the fundamental inspection issue. Namely, is Iran's nuclear program peaceful? Based on documents in the archive and its own investigations, the IAEA has alleged that Iran has undeclared nuclear material and activities. It has pressed Iran for access to 2 former EMET sites and asked Iran for true cooperation. After months and great pressure from other nations, Iran eventually allowed the access to the 2 sites, but refused to cooperate in the IAEA investigation, continuing the charade of denying ever having had a nuclear weapons program. The IAEA characterized Iran's explanations as, quote, unsatisfactory and, quote, not technically credible. One way to undermine this important IAEA effort is to rush to rejoin the JCPOA before these issues are resolved. It needs the time to wrestle with the core nuclear question: is Iran's nuclear program peaceful? This issue should be front and center in any re-engagement with Iran. Resolving this issue should be a priority today, independent of the fate of the JCPOA. I must mention that other forces are at play. Earlier, I mentioned that pressure has included military threats. It has also included covert actions against Iranian nuclear facilities and nuclear personnel. With the general buildup of military conflicts in the region, the lack of faith in the JCPOA, and Iran's nuclear brinkmanship, it is not surprising that military actions have occurred against Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites and personnel. The destruction last summer of the Iran Centrifuge Assembly Center, or ICAC, at the Natanz site, and the killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh are but two recent examples. Let me now switch to sharing a screen. Let me see if I can actually do this. Hopefully that worked. This is an image showing the destroyed Iran Centrifuge Assembly Center at the Natanz site. As you can see, it's heavily destroyed. This is a recent image from early January, and they're actually cleaning up the sites. And you can see a rubble pile, and they're even salvaging some of the roofing materials. But you can see that it was heavily destroyed. When we assessed this site using commercial satellite imagery, we concluded that a bomb had been planted under a corner of the building, a very powerful bomb that then, when it exploded, destroyed the entire facility. We obviously don't know who did it. No one jumped up to claim credit. And it certainly set a part of the centrifuge program back. This facility had been finished, had been built, finished during the process or during the period when the JCPOA was in force, or being fully implemented, I should say. And it was built to be able to construct, it's called the final assembly, of thousands of advanced centrifuges to allow Iran to dramatically scale up its gas centrifuge program, which is allowed in the endpoints of the JCPOA. And this was a site that could have done that. Given the brinkmanship that was going on, somebody decided that they didn't want Iran to be able to mass produce advanced centrifuges anytime soon. But unfortunately, the way this works is that while time's been bought, that doesn't settle the issue. Iran, within weeks, announced, or a few months, announced that it was going to replace the site, but this time underground. And there's a construction project going on not far from the Natanz site, where they're currently constructing an underground facility. And if you look at this image, you can see where it's marked Mountain Peak, and on either side of it, you can see basically tunnel entrances. And if you look at the area between those two tunnel entrances on the eastern and western side, there's plenty of room to put create the floor space that was in the original assembly facility at the Natanz site. And also make sure that the tunnels are large enough from the entrances that they're protected against blast. So certainly Iran has responded to the attack with an effort to build a more protected site. Let me just show one other image just to give you an idea. You can see the construction staging area, and then you can see the eastern tunnel entrances. And here's a spoil pile is visible too. Let me stop there.
Right. Okay. So.
Well, I'm sorry. Let me stop with the screen sharing there. I want to make several other points. Sorry.
Okay. Go ahead.
Do you think I'm talking too long?
Not at all. Not at all. Okay. It's very important stuff.
And as I said, no one claimed credit for the bombing of this centrifuge assembly facility, although obviously most think it's Israel. And similarly for Fakhrizadeh's killing. Now, these attacks, which surprisingly few condemned, are a reminder that the United States and the E3 are are not the only stakeholders in this grim contest with Iran, and diplomacy is not the only option. Moreover, these attacks should stand as a warning of the risk of once again trying to sideline key Middle Eastern stakeholders from any negotiations concerning Iran. Now, the Biden administration faces a dilemma on Iran. On the one hand, Iran is pressing ahead with increasing its nuclear weapons capabilities, reducing its breakout timelines, and adding capabilities such as uranium metal production, which is often seen as a symbol of making nuclear weapons, certainly as a way to threaten that. Overall, Iran wants to scare the United States into quickly rejoining the nuclear deal and dropping its sanctions. And it certainly has plenty of allies in the European Union and among certain parts of the NGO community. On the other hand, the administration knows, or it should know, that Iran has made significant concessions only after large amounts of pressure have been applied. It is naive to expect that once US sanctions are removed, Iran will negotiate significant extensions of nuclear sunsets, limitations on its missiles, or curbs on its regional activities. If anything, a quick rejoining of the JCPOA with a halt to US sanctions will fund nuclear missile and regional nuclear buildups. Any negotiations after the US drops its sanctions and rejoins the JCPOA will likely be mere talk shops to discuss these issues with little prospect of success, as missile talks largely were after the JCPOA was implemented. Now, what do you do about this situation? Of course, Iran's nuclear buildups are threatening. They do provide a sense of urgency. But the end state of the JCPOA, when the major sunsets have expired in 2030, will look far more threatening than the situation today. I talked about Iran was preparing to build thousands of advanced centrifuges. That's what you're facing in 2030. So overall, it's better not to fall for Iran's threats today. The administration should not hurry, and it should seek far more than merely rejoining the JCPOA in exchange for sanctions relief. It is better to continue building pressure on Iran. The supreme leader makes the decisions, not Iran's president. So the upcoming Iranian presidential election in June is not going to change that reality. Likewise, the reestablishment of the JCPOA is not going to lead to a reformist president able to change Iran's nuclear and regional trajectories. So it makes sense to be patient and clarify the desired end states. Now, at my institution, we call it the Good ISIS, we've certainly thought deeply about what's the problem in the nuclear deal. And I think after lots of detailed analysis, it really comes down to two major issues, at least on the nuclear side. One is it's critically important to support the International Atomic Energy Agency to just simply do its job, which it hasn't been doing for years when it comes to Iran. Inspections need to be improved. Inspectors need to have systematic access to military sites and personnel and cooperation from Iran. Another is that the sunsets on the nuclear limitations are woefully inadequate. I can remember discussions in 2013 with people who were going to be part of the negotiating team on the more technical side of the negotiating team. Routinely, it was viewed that the sunsets would be well over 20 years. 20 years would be a minimum. Really, the sunsets start to end after 10 years and are gone at 15 for the important limitations. So they're just too short. Now, a new development since the implementation of the JCPOA is it's quite clear Iran's centrifuge program will never be commercially viable. It'll always be able to buy low-enriched uranium for civil nuclear reasons, cheaper on the international market than it'll ever make it domestically. So its idea of building a large centrifuge program is just a mirage that only is going to become a reality if it's used to make nuclear weapons. So I think a realistic goal, albeit hard, is that the goal be that Iran have no gas centrifuge program. If that is impossible, the sunsets are going to have to be a lot longer than they are today. Now, of course, the nuclear missile program needs to be eliminated, because in the end, a nuclear weapon is the ability to, is a combination of the nuclear explosive material, weapon grade uranium. It's the ability to weaponize that weapon grade uranium, and it's the ability to deliver it, which in the case of Iran essentially means a ballistic missile. And so one has to worry a great deal as Iran has developed precision guided missiles. It now appears to be developing, or at least the early stages of developing ICBMs. So that also has to be taken on. But for strictly the nuclear deal, if you want to cripple the nuclear weapons program, get rid of enrichment, or let the IAEA truly do its job so we know that Iran does not have a nuclear weaponization program in the closet, ready to go at the command of the supreme leader and his coterie. And in this effort, the US does have tremendous leverage because of the sanctions. And so they've worked much better than expected. Let me just end there. I could go on. I think I went on a little longer than I intended, which was 20 minutes. So let me just end there. And I do think that there's a tremendous opportunity and a challenge today to finally start to address Iran's nuclear weapons threats.
Right. Okay, so you really touched on so many important things, but one thing is that you touched on is that we cannot just eliminate the sanctions in order to get Iran to sit at the table with us, because that's our only leverage. That's what they want, is the sanctions relief. So Aviv Kochavi, the IDF's chief of staff, said recently at the INSS conference that the JCPOA should not be rejoined, calling such a move, quote, not the right thing to do. He said that he's ordered the military to draw up fresh plans for conducting a strike against Iran in order to prevent them from obtaining a nuclear weapon. What do you think propelled him to say this?
Yeah, I was surprised by his comment. It came at the end of essentially, I guess, an hour-long speech laying out Israel's security concerns and solutions. And the IDF, from my experience, tends to be rather conservative on military strikes. So I was surprised, and clearly many Israeli government officials believe that the JCPOA is almost immoral in how it's gone about its business. And I think his statement along that line was mostly surprising, that he's given his position, not so much the criticism itself. But his order to plan for additional types of military strikes was truly surprising. And I think it just shows that times have changed. The Iranian program is more mature. The region is more united, that is a threat. Their stakes are higher. Iran's actions are now clearly recognized as stimulating nuclear proliferation in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, it's made it clear it's not going to, in a sense, be without nuclear weapons if Iran gets it. I think the growing fear, I know my institute is Saudi Arabia may move ahead because it perceives that Iran is eventually going to get them, so why don't we get them first? So I think you're already seeing, in a sense, a nuclear arms race developing. And so I think the issue of military strikes, I think, has to be recognized as a reason that people should not rush into the JCPOA. The stakes, the risk of war is going to go up, I believe, if there's a quick rejoin into the JCPOA. And I think the General Chief of Staff was making that point.
Okay, General Rafael Grossi, the IAEA director, recently said that reviving the nuclear deal must happen within the coming weeks. He said this in response to Iran threatening to stop adhering to the IAEA's supplementary inspection regime, known as additional protocol. Not adhering to the additional protocol would be a significant problem for implementing nuclear safeguards in a country like Iran, which has routinely hidden sites and activities with nuclear weapons applications. But is he right? Why would the head of the IAEA, a technical organization, make such a comment? Is it appropriate for him to do so? If not, why not?
Yeah, I don't think it's appropriate. I mean, certainly the IAEA has to worry that Iran is going to withdraw its adherence to the additional protocol. It's a powerful inspection tool. It's not the only one. There's still the basic safeguards agreement that would allow the IAEA to push Iran hard. Did it to North Korea in the past. It's done it to other countries. So not all is lost if the additional protocol goes, but it is a loss. But there's a different issue here. The IAEA is a technical organization, and it should not be involved in discussions of the nuclear deal or Iranian legislation, which is what's driving that threat. And so it was inappropriate for Grossi to make that comment. And in fact, it shows a problem in the JCPOA. It's inadvertently created unhealthy pressures on the IAEA to pull its punches and to become politically involved in issues that it should best avoid. The structure of the deal puts the IAEA in an impossible situation that Iran always seeks to exploit. And this in particular affects key inspection issues such as access to Iranian military sites or cooperation on issues of undeclared materials and activities.
Right. I mean, I remember in 2015, the deal was signed or agreed upon in the spring, like May, and then in October, there were the Majlis, the Iranian parliament met, and they decided that military sites were off limits in their reading of the deal. So, you know, if I were an Iranian and I would want to hide some nuclear activity, I would just call it a military site. Now, I don't know if the IAEA has been able to enter into these military sites at all. Have they? Do you know?
Very rarely. And they, using the information in the nuclear archives, they were able to create a ironclad rationale to be able to access two former Ahmad sites. One had been involved in uranium conversion activities. One was involved in testing components of nuclear weapons. And they were able to establish that these sites likely had undeclared nuclear materials and activities, which is really code for major violation. Mm-hmm. And Iran finally, after months, did allow access, but has refused to cooperate. And it's taken a position that if it's happened in the past like this, we will not answer. And of course, if you're going to decide or determine a country's program is peaceful, the only way to do it is by looking into the past. I mean, tomorrow, the past of tomorrow is today. And so if you want to know, is a country going to build nuclear weapons? Does it have a truly peaceful nuclear program? Then naturally you're going to look at what they've done yesterday, the day before that, and the years before that. And that's a standard IAEA practice applied to many, many countries, including South Africa's nuclear weapons program, including Taiwan's nuclear weapons program. And those countries cooperated. Iran has refused. And so it is still a fact that that the inspectors can rarely access the military sites they need to go to, and they can never get the cooperation from the Iranians that other countries have freely given. And that should stand as a sign that Iran is hiding something. And the JCPOA is not dealing with that at all. And new negotiations should focus on that. They could have back in 2014 and 2015. A decision was made not to do it. Iran had said no access to military sites. That's a red line for us. Unfortunately, the US bought into that and didn't make it a condition of the implementation of the JCPOA that the IAEA's concerns and about secret nuclear weapons activities were addressed.
Okay. All right, so now I'm going to turn the podium over to our very capable and talented Sarah Leah Thompson, who will read the questions that have come in.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, David, so much for joining us today. We have had a number of questions sent in, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. The first question we have, what are the options for Israel in regards to the Iranian nuclear program? Will Israel's Sunni neighborhood add support to Israel? And if not, can Israel go it alone?
I don't think Israel needs to go it alone. I think it's, and it certainly should expect to be able to engage fully with the United States during the negotiations. Even if it doesn't like the JCPOA, which it clearly doesn't as a government, it can be fully engaged in the negotiations. It's not enough that the United States sits down with the E3 and works up positions. Israel should be at the table. So should the states in the Gulf region, such as Saudi Arabia. And while this is perhaps difficult to do, there's been tougher situations dealt with in diplomacy. And it's critical that the true stakeholders are involved. Well, now Germany, France, and Britain are becoming more threatened. Iran can now reach at least, well, let's say Iran can reach Europe now if it puts its Shahid 3 missiles in Syria. So if Iran did go for nuclear weapons, it could target Europe. But it's a little more of an abstract threat. The states in the Gulf region, Israel, are directly threatened and really have to be at the table one way or the other. So they're part of whatever negotiations happen. And the US should be there to facilitate that and make sure it happens.
Great, thank you. The next question, what about the stationing of Iranian missiles in Venezuela? Is this an issue that the White House is addressing?
I'm not familiar with that, so I'd rather not try to answer that. I don't know the facts of that.
No problem. Okay, another question. How can the US and Israel be certain that Iran doesn't already have nuclear devices that are either homemade or imported?
Well, the fundamental reason for that is, and the Nuclear Archive documentation supports this, that Iran in 2003 had not finished building the site to make the weapon-grade uranium. That site is the Fordow site. And the continuation of Fordow after Ahmad was, or the construction of that, was part of that continuation of its nuclear weapons program. But it didn't finish in 2003. There's pretty good evidence that Iran didn't secretly acquire significant amounts of weapon-grade uranium or separated plutonium through the black markets. And since 2003, Iran's enrichment program has been largely declared and watched very carefully. Now, Iran had threatened after the discovery of Fordow and its subjugation to IAEA inspections that it was going to build 10 more enrichment plants in secret. Of course, never to do with nuclear weapons, but nonetheless, there was a lot of worry in the run-up to the negotiations of the JCPOA that they had a secret enrichment site someplace. That concern was addressed before the United States would enter negotiations with Iran. So I think there's an overall sense that Iran has not built a secret centrifuge plant, has not accumulated in secret weapon-grade uranium, and so that you can say that because of that, they don't have nuclear weapons today.
Great, thank you. The next question. In retrospect, do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Prime Minister Barak were correct in pushing for a strike in 2012 when the IDF and Mossad were opposed? And 9 years later, do you think such a strike would make any difference beyond a delay of Iran's nuclear progress?
Well, I mean, I think just constitutionally, I'm not supportive of military strikes on Iran's nuclear program. I lived in Israel in 1981 when the Osiris reactor was attacked by Prime Minister Begin, and had misgivings about it. And I think the problem is that it is just a way to buy time. Now, sometimes that works. Israel struck the reactor in Syria before it could operate. And then Syria, I think, did try to reconstitute its program after that, but its civil war ended that. And so you don't know how it's going to work out. In the case of Iraq, it led to a much larger, more secretive nuclear weapons program that really only ended inadvertently. If Saddam had not invaded Kuwait in 1990, he probably would have had nuclear weapons by the end of that decade. And so you can't, military strikes just are not enough. Now, they can slow things. And one of the things that's evolved since that discussion on military strikes is that covert methods are being used. There's been killings of nuclear scientists in Iran. I discussed the destruction of the Iran Centrifuge Assembly Center. And I would expect those are going to continue. There's also been a much greater emphasis on espionage. It was a brilliant stroke for Israel to seize the nuclear archive. They also identified a site where nuclear-related equipment and material was stored that the IAEA eventually was able to go to and found evidence of undeclared nuclear activities and uranium. And so or at least they found undeclared uranium, and it pointed to undeclared nuclear activities and undeclared nuclear material at other sites. So I think the trend has been to look at not so much as the grand military strike, although that's still a possibility, but at smaller strikes, smaller activities, and then to combine that with other counterproliferation activities and ultimately combine it with diplomacy to try to make sure that Iran does not build nuclear weapons.
Great, thank you so much. For our next question, we've been hearing lately about various advanced centrifuges that Iran has installed. Can you please explain the differences between these centrifuges and what makes them more advanced than what they had previously?
Well, a gas centrifuge is essentially just a very rapidly spinning tube that separates uranium. And you can do things to improve the amount that you separate in one of these centrifuges. And you can increase its speed, you can increase its length. And both of those will increase the amount of enriched uranium that you produce per centrifuge. Now, Iran started with some very archaic centrifuges and it acquired the designs and a certain number of them from Pakistan. Pakistan gave Iran a more advanced centrifuge design. Now, Pakistan got those designs from Europe. The clunky one was from the Netherlands. The more advanced one was from Germany. Iran decided to develop the clunkier one, the one that Pakistan decided not to develop. And it's just not operated that well. Now, through the last 15 years or so, Iran's been developing these more advanced ones. And so essentially, they're switching over to centrifuges that are going to produce enriched uranium at a rate of anywhere from 3 to 7 to 10 times more quickly. And so the bottom line is the advanced centrifuges produce enriched uranium faster.
Got it. Thank you. Our next question, is there still a connection between North Korea and Iran?
On missiles and conventional weapons, yes, indeed. There is a connection. And they may be conspiring to buy things illicitly together or for each other. The nuclear connection is murkier. Following Fakhrizadeh's killing, there was kind of a surge of public discussion in Iran on their media about Fakhrizadeh and who he was, and part of that led to revelations that a statement by the former head of the IRGC that said he had tried to start nuclear cooperation, intended to start nuclear cooperation with Iran with North Korea in the 1990s, but was kind of pulled back from that. but he did establish missile cooperation. Nonetheless, some cooperation did happen, and I'm finishing a book on Iran's nuclear weapons program. It's tentatively called Iran's Perilous Pursuit of Nuclear Weapons. And in that developed a report by a journalist who dug very deeply into using intelligence sources and IAEA sources and others, that there was cooperation on the theoretical side of making nuclear weapons. And it involved the exchange of people and skills, it involved some computer software, but more importantly, some modeling help to understand nuclear weapons theoretically better.
Great. Thank you so much. For our next question, do you believe that the Biden administration has a realistic perspective on Iran?
I wouldn't know how to judge that. I mean, the people in the Biden administration are very competent, experienced people, and we'll have to see. I mean, I think the world has changed since the JCPOA was negotiated, and I'm sure they have seen those changes, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Got it. Thank you. Next question. Is there evidence that Iran is continuing to pursue the alternative plutonium path to a nuclear weapon?
Well, interestingly, in this recent legislation passed by the Iranian parliament, I mean, I didn't talk about it very much, but it's been in the news. Normally, the Iranian parliament could pass legislation like this and it goes nowhere, but this time the Guardian Council, sort of the supreme leaders organ, approved it, didn't veto it, and so it became law. And in that is a list of expectations or demands that Iran scale up its nuclear program, and part of that is they're required to build a new reactor, and to finish the reactor called the Iraq reactor, which is covered by the JCPOA, and was being modified so it couldn't make weapon-grade plutonium. The legislation calls for it to be finished, essentially without modification. So the legislation has opened the door again to the idea that they could pursue the weapon-grade plutonium route. They're a long way from succeeding, and in fact, what you see in the EMET plan documentation is that there are some documents on using weapon-grade plutonium in nuclear weapons, but it was more of a watching brief, because I think it was clear 2001 that it was going to take Iran a long time to reach the point of being able to make weapon-grade plutonium, and that's separated, but they could make weapon-grade uranium at that time, or put in the infrastructure to make it on a significant scale, and that's the way they went. But the weapon-grade plutonium is always in the background and always has to be remembered.
Great. Thank you. The next question. Please clarify what Iran did and did not do to comply with the provision to disable the Iraq heavy water reactor. How is it possible going forward to eliminate the Iranian production of plutonium short of anywhere, anytime, unfettered inspections?
Well, the Iraq reactor was certainly a target of the technical community in the JCPOA negotiations. And the idea that was developed was to put in several steps that would drastically reduce the amount of plutonium produced in the reactor and have it produced in fuel that really Iran could not chemically process to extract the plutonium, and to encourage Iran to, and some of this I'm remembering, spent fuel would leave the country eventually. That last part I'm not struggling to remember. Maybe someone else can add to that. But Iran has certainly wanted to keep the option of taking out those modifications. And so a couple of years ago, it was revealed that Iran had built another, let's call it a calandria. The old calandria had been destroyed as part of one of these modifications. And the calandria is just a vessel that holds the fuel. But the idea was make the calandria smaller so that it would again diminish the ability to make weapon-grade plutonium. But Iran had in secret managed to make this. So the JCPOA limitations were quite robust, but you always have to worry that Iran is trying to undermine those. And here with this new legislation, is the parliament is openly demanding that Iran build another reactor that would be able to make weapon-grade plutonium. So I think so long as Iran has these sensitive nuclear facilities, we're going to have this problem. And that's certainly one of the things that's driven me from a strong position of support for the JCPOA limitations on centrifuges in 2015 to a position the enrichment program should be eliminated. Heavy water reactors like Iraq should simply be banned in Iran. I think the only solution that's going to be decisive in the end is if these technologies don't exist in Iran. Otherwise, we're going to be constantly fighting over Iran's attempts to undermine those limitations and essentially have a capability to build nuclear weapons on demand. Now, the other way to deal with it, and it could work just as well, is that Iran does make the decision, we don't want nuclear weapons, and you can come and establish that. And you can come anytime, anywhere, and show to yourself that our program has truly ended and we have no intention to restart it. And that's what Taiwan did and South Africa did and other countries have done. Iran adamantly refuses. So I would say in the negotiations, the United States has to get one of those two things, either bans on these kind of sensitive technologies. And again, that ban is exactly what this UN Security Council demanded for well over a decade. No enrichment, no reprocessing in Iran. It's what was established in 2003 with the freeze in the enrichment program. No enrichment. It was only frozen, and that fell apart later. But still, it was much deeper restriction than the JCPOA. The other is, let's Iran show the world that it really has turned the corner, believes in that supreme leader, fatwa, banning nuclear weapons, and is willing to prove it to the world. Either one of those could work. JCPOA is a muddled mess of having neither.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. Next one, are Russia and China indifferent to an Iran with an atomic bomb?
No. They definitely would be threatened. But they're not that, but they're complicated. I don't know how else to put it. I think Russia's recently taken positions at the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's on the Board of Governors. It's very active in the debate. I think Iran would have to almost detonate a nuclear explosion before Russia would say, oh, something's wrong here. It's become a very reactionary force, fighting inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's become a strong supporter of Iran as it tries to beat off inspections. It supports Iran in not answering questions, legitimate questions by the IAEA. And so Iran, the United States is going to have to deal with this, with this problem with Russia. China, I think, is much less involved. It's not as anxious to see Iran become a hegemon in the Middle East. But at the same time, it is increasingly a U.S. adversary, and it's might be looking to draw Iran into its orbit. So it's a difficult situation, and that's why I think in the end, negotiations by the U.S. are going to have to be a lot more hard-headed than they were in 2013 and 2014 and 2015. The situation is reaching a boiling point. And at the same time, I think countries would be terribly remiss to remove the threat of military strikes in all kinds of forms from the table. Iran is a dangerous state, and the negotiations very well may not work, or the negotiations will lead to something that is completely unacceptable.
Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions.
Right. So David, you just actually said something incredibly valuable. And I think diplomacy without the credible threat of a military strike is meaningless. I think we have to understand that. And I know the Iranians are very good negotiators. You know, they invented the Persian bazaar, and they know how to sell a small rug for thousands and thousands of dollars. And unfortunately, in the United States, we tend to trust. And as Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. I think at EMET we believe first verify and then trust. But I want to thank you so much, David, for your expertise and for your knowledge that you're so willing to share with us. It's incredibly valuable, especially now. And I should say that, you know, all of this, it costs a great deal of money, but we are very, very happy to do this because we believe that an educated public can translate into good public policy. So, you know, all of this is very, very important. And I want to thank you, David, once again for your wisdom and your expertise. Let's hope that there will be a peaceful resolution to the conflict, but I'm not so sure there will be at this point. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.